On March 28, 1757, in the very heart of Paris, thousands gathered in a square that would soon become the stage for one of the most horrific spectacles in European history. A man named Robert-François Damiens was about to suffer a punishment so savage that even hardened executioners hesitated to carry it out. He would be the last person in France ever condemned to be torn apart by horses, a medieval execution method carried into the so-called Age of Enlightenment. What unfolded that day was not just the death of one man, but the symbolic collapse of an old world built on absolute monarchy and divine authority. Damiens was not a general, not a conspirator leading an uprising, nor a figure of great political importance. He was an ordinary servant, a man of humble origin whose single, desperate act of defiance against the person of the king would cost him everything. His story demonstrates how fragile absolute power truly is, and how violently it lashes out when even lightly challenged. The authorities chose a punishment long reserved for crimes considered the gravest: offenses against the crown, public quartering, known in French legal tradition as écartèlement. It was never just about killing. It was theater, carefully staged ritual meant to terrify, to show that the monarch's body and authority were untouchable, and that any who dared challenge him would be reduced to nothing but a broken, mutilated body. Yet, on that March afternoon, the gruesome spectacle did not go as planned. What was intended as a quick and decisive display of royal power became instead a prolonged ordeal, a torture that seemed to mock the very idea of justice. The horses struggled, the executioners hesitated, and the crowd, instead of being awed into obedience, recoiled in horror at what they saw. For hours, Damiens endured agony, refusing to die even as his body was torn apart piece by piece. The official records of his execution, preserved with almost clinical detail, read today like something out of a nightmare, but they were not fiction. They were witnessed by thousands who carried away an unforgettable image of monarchy's cruelty exposed before its own people. To fully grasp the significance of that day, one must first understand the France of 1757. The kingdom was ruled by Louis XV, grandson of the Sun King Louis XIV, who had once embodied the very height of absolutism. But Louis XV was not his grandfather. He was indecisive, distracted, more infamous for his mistresses than for his governance. France's prestige was sinking under the weight of the disastrous 7 Years' War. Its treasury was bleeding, and its military suffered repeated defeats. Dissatisfaction was spreading not only among the poor, but even within the once loyal elites of the parliaments. At the same time, new ideas were circulating. In Parisian salons and coffeehouses, philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot were questioning the church, the monarchy, and the very principle of divine right. The ground beneath the Bourbon throne was shifting. In this charged atmosphere, Robert-François Damiens emerged. Born in 1715 in the small village of La Thuloy, near Arras, he came from the lowest strata of society. He lived as a domestique, moving from household to household, never secure, never rising above the rank of servant. At times he worked for members of the Parliament of Paris, where disputes with the crown were common. Through such work, Damiens likely overheard endless talk of corruption, taxation, and discontent with royal authority. Historians still debate how much these experiences shaped him, but what is clear is that he was no revolutionary mastermind. He was a simple man whose frustrations and desperation would drive him into history. On January 5, 1757, as dusk settled over Versailles, Damiens stepped forward from a crowd of courtiers. The king was leaving the palace, preparing to enter his carriage, when Damiens struck him with a small knife. The wound was minor. The blade barely pierced the thick winter garments, but the symbolism was explosive. The sacred body of the king, believed to embody divine authority itself, had been touched, had been wounded. Witnesses gasped, guards rushed forward, and the entire court erupted into panic. Damiens made no attempt to flee. Shockingly, he seemed almost bewildered by what he had done. When seized, he is said to have declared, "I did not mean to kill him, only to touch him, to remind him of the misery of his people." If this was true, it showed he had not acted out of hatred or conspiracy, but desperation, a plea, rather, than an attempt at regicide. Still, under the system of divine right, even the lightest wound inflicted upon the king was treated as an assault upon God himself. The immediate chaos that followed revealed just how fragile the monarchy had become. The king, believing himself mortally wounded, began confessing and preparing for last rites. Courtiers panicked, rumors spread of vast conspiracies, and the authorities responded with overwhelming severity. Damiens was interrogated relentlessly. Under torture, he gave rambling and contradictory explanations, sometimes blaming religious visions, other times political grievances. There was no evidence of a plot. He had acted alone, yet the monarchy, terrified by its vulnerability, needed to make an example of him. The sentence was quartering by horses, the ancient punishment reserved for the greatest of traitors. By carrying out this barbarity in the Age of Enlightenment, the crown hoped to send a message that the king's body was still sacred, his authority still unshakable. Instead, what Paris witnessed was the opposite, a spectacle of cruelty that seemed grotesque and futile. A monarchy so insecure that it destroyed an insignificant man in the most brutal way possible. Robert-François Damiens would go down in history, not as a great revolutionary, but as the last victim of France's most archaic and terrifying punishment. His death marked not the triumph of royal power, but its crisis. For when an institution must resort to such horror to defend itself, it is already weakening. Within a generation, the monarchy that had mutilated a servant in its defense would itself be dragged to the guillotine. Damiens' execution was, in a sense, the opening act of a drama that would end in the French Revolution. Officials desperately sought to uncover a conspiracy that may never have existed. His background was scrutinized, his associates questioned, and his movements in the days leading up to the attack traced in minute detail. The authorities' response to the attack revealed both the strength and the fragility of absolute monarchy. On one hand, the swift capture of Damiens and the immediate mobilization of the entire security apparatus demonstrated the power at the monarchy's disposal. On the other hand, the paranoid investigation and the ultimate decision to execute Damiens in the most brutal manner possible revealed a system terrified of its own people and willing to use extreme violence to maintain its authority. The legal proceedings against Robert-François Damiens began immediately after his arrest, but they were proceedings in name only. In a system where the king was both the source of law and the victim of the crime, there could be only one possible outcome. The trial was less about determining guilt, which was obvious, than about deciding the appropriate punishment for such an unprecedented act of lèse-majesté. The court that tried Damiens was the Parliament of Paris, the same high court where he had once worked as a servant. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers that Damiens would be judged by the very institution where he had been exposed to criticism of royal authority. The judges, however, showed no mercy to their former employee. They understood that the stability of the entire social order depended on making an example of anyone who dared to lay hands on the sacred person of the king. The charges against Damiens were formally stated as parricide, not the killing of a parent, but the attempted killing of the father of his people. As the king was ceremonially known, this charge carried with it not just the death penalty, but death in its most terrible form. The law was clear. Those who committed parricide were to be subjected to dismemberment by horses, a punishment that had been part of French legal tradition for centuries, but was rarely applied. The sentence pronounced against Damiens was read aloud in court with ceremonial gravity. He was to be taken to the Plaster grave, the traditional site of royal executions in Paris. There his flesh would be torn with red-hot pen. Molten lead would be poured into his wounds, and his right hand, the hand that had struck the king, would be burned with sulfur. Only then would he be tied to 4 horses and torn apart, his remains burned and scattered to the winds. This elaborate ritual of punishment was designed to mirror the crime in its symbolic significance. Just as Damiens had violated the sacred body of the king, so his own body would be systematically violated and destroyed. The public nature of the execution was equally important. It was meant to serve as a deterrent to others who might harbor similar thoughts of rebellion against royal authority. The preparations for the execution took months, during which Damiens remained imprisoned in the Conciergerie, the notorious prison attached to the Pale D's. During this time, he was repeatedly interrogated, tortured, and pressed to reveal accomplices who may never have existed. The authorities seemed unable to accept that such a momentous act could have been committed by a single unremarkable man, acting alone. Contemporary accounts describe Damiens' behavior during his imprisonment as erratic and often contradictory. Sometimes he seemed resigned to his fate, other times defiant. He occasionally claimed that he had acted on divine inspiration, other times that he had been driven by concern for the suffering of the French people. These contradictions only fueled speculation about his mental state and motivations, but they did nothing to alter the inevitable outcome of his trial. The morning of March 28, 1757 dawned gray and cold over Paris. By early morning, crowds had begun gathering in the Plaster, the ancient execution ground that had witnessed countless deaths over the centuries. The square, located near the Seine River and surrounded by medieval buildings, was transformed into an amphitheater of death, with wooden scaffolds erected to give spectators a better view of the proceedings. The execution was scheduled to begin at noon, and the preparations had been meticulous. The executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, came from a family that had served as royal executioners for generations. Even for someone accustomed to death, the task ahead was daunting. The method of execution, dismemberment by horses, had not been performed in France for decades, and the practical details had to be worked out through consultation with historical records and older executioners who remembered similar cases. 4 horses had been selected for their strength and trained for their grisly task. The animals, according to contemporary accounts, seemed to sense the unnatural nature of what they were being asked to do. They were restless and difficult to control, as if they, too, were reluctant participants in the day's events. The symbolism was not lost on observers. Even the beasts of burden seemed to rebel against the brutality they were being forced to commit. The scaffold was constructed in the center of the square, with chains and ropes carefully arranged to ensure that Damiens could be properly secured. Red-hot panzers had been prepared, along with molten lead and sulfur for the preliminary torches that would precede the actual dismemberment. Every detail had been planned to maximize both the physical agony and the symbolic impact of the execution. As the crowd grew throughout the morning, the atmosphere in the square became increasingly tense. This was not to be an ordinary execution. Everyone present understood that they were about to witness something extraordinary and terrible. Many in the crowd had come from great distances, drawn by morbid curiosity about a punishment that belonged more to the Middle Ages than to the supposedly enlightened 18th century. The spectators represented all levels of French society. Nobles had secured prime viewing positions on balconies overlooking the square, while common people packed the streets and alleys. Vendors moved through the crowd selling food and drink, treating the execution as a kind of festival. The mood was a mixture of anticipation, revulsion, and fascination, emotions that would soon give way to horror as the reality of what they were witnessing became clear. When Damiens was finally brought to the scaffold, he appeared calm, but resigned. Dressed in a simple white shirt, he looked smaller and more ordinary than the crowd had expected. Here was no obvious monster or fanatic, but a middle-aged man who seemed almost bewildered by the circumstances in which he found himself. His ordinariness made what was about to happen all the more disturbing. At precisely noon, the execution began with the preliminary tortures specified in Damiens' sentence. His flesh was torn with red-hot pincers, causing him to cry out in agony. Molten lead was then poured into the wounds, and his right hand was burned with sulfur until the flesh was charred and blackened. Throughout these preliminary torments, Damiens remained conscious and aware, his screams echoing across the silent square. These initial tortures, horrible as they were merely the prelude to the main event. The real punishment, the dismemberment, that would give this execution its place in history, was yet to come. As the executioners prepared to attach the ropes to Damiens' limbs, even they seemed hesitant about what they were about to do. The crowd, which had been vocal and animated earlier, fell into an unnatural silence. The horses were brought forward, each one held by a separate handler. The animals seemed to sense the tension in the air and were difficult to control. Ropes were attached to Damiens' arms and legs, connecting him to the 4 horses positioned at the corners of the scaffold. The executioners checked and rechecked their arrangements, knowing that what came next would test their skill and their stomach for the work they had chosen. What happened next would be seared into the memory of everyone present and would ultimately contribute to the abolition of such barbaric punishments in France. The attempt to tear Damiens apart with horses, which should have been completed within minutes, stretched on for hours. The horses, despite being whipped and spurred, seemed reluctant to pull with sufficient force to dismember a human body. The failure of the horses to complete their grisly task quickly became apparent to everyone in the square. The animals would strain against their ropes, causing Damiens excruciating pain as his joints were stretched to their limits, but his limbs remained attached to his torso. The executioners, growing increasingly desperate, tried various strategies to encourage the horses to pull harder, but nothing seemed to work effectively. As the minutes turned to hours, the mood of the crowd began to shift dramatically. What had begun as morbid entertainment became something much more disturbing. Spectators who had come expecting to witness swift, if brutal, justice, instead found themselves watching a prolonged torture that seemed to have no end. Some began to leave, unable to stomach what they were seeing, while others remained transfixed by the horror unfolding before them. The executioners, realizing that the horses alone would not be sufficient, began to make additional cuts in Damiens' joints with knives and saws. Even this brutal intervention did not immediately resolve the problem. His arms were eventually separated from his body, but his legs proved more resistant. Contemporary accounts describe the sound of breaking bones and tearing flesh, sounds that carried clearly across the now silent square. Throughout this prolonged ordeal, Damiens remained conscious and aware. Witnesses reported that he continued to speak, sometimes crying out in pain, other times seeming to pray or make statements that were difficult to understand. His persistence in clinging to life in the face of such systematic destruction of his body became part of the horror of the day. It was as if his very refusal to die was a final act of defiance against a system that was destroying him. The crowd's reaction evolved from bloodthirsty anticipation to horrified fascination to outright revulsion. Many spectators later reported feeling sick or faint as the execution dragged on far longer than anyone had expected. The theoretical support for brutal punishment was one thing. Witnessing its reality was quite another. The gap between abstract justice and concrete horror became painfully clear to everyone present. Finally, after what contemporary accounts describe as several hours of agony, Damiens died. His body was then burned, and his ashes were scattered, as specified in his sentence. But the damage had already been done, not just to Damiens, but to the entire system of royal justice that had ordered such a spectacle. The execution that was meant to demonstrate the power and majesty of absolute monarchy had instead revealed its fundamental brutality and inhumanity. The immediate aftermath of Damiens' execution was a mixture of shock, revulsion, and soul-aching that reverberated through French society at all levels. The crowd that dispersed from the plaster carried with them not just the memory of what they had witnessed, but a profound unease about the system of justice that could order such brutality. Many who had come expecting to see swift, if harsh, punishment instead found themselves questioning the very foundations of royal authority. Contemporary accounts of the execution, written by witnesses from various social backgrounds, reveal the profound impact the event had on those who observed it. Even hardened officials who had overseen numerous executions expressed shock at what they had witnessed. The Marquise Pompadour Louis Vuitton's influential mistress reportedly became physically ill when she heard detailed accounts of the execution. The king himself, upon learning of the prolonged nature of Damiens' death, was said to have expressed regret at the severity of the sentence. The international reaction was equally significant. Foreign ambassadors and visitors to Paris carried news of the execution back to their home countries, where it was received with a mixture of fascination and horror. Enlightenment philosophers across Europe seized upon the event as evidence of the barbarism that still lurked beneath the veneer of civilized society. Voltaire, already a critic of judicial torture and cruel punishment, used the Damiens case as ammunition in his campaign for legal reform. The execution also had unexpected consequences for the royal family itself. Louis XVI, who had initially demanded the harshest possible punishment for his attacker, found himself haunted by the prolonged brutality of Damiens' death. Some historians suggest that the king's apparent loss of nerve in later crises can be traced back to this moment when the full implications of absolute power were revealed in their most naked form. The Catholic Church, which had supported the execution as just punishment for an attack on God's anointed representative, also found itself in an uncomfortable position. The prolonged nature of Damiens' suffering raised theological questions about mercy and forgiveness that church officials struggled to answer. Some clergy began to question whether such extreme punishment was compatible with Christian teaching about redemption and human dignity. Perhaps most significantly, the Damiens' execution became a rallying point for opponents of judicial torture and cruel punishment. Legal reformers who had previously argued their case on abstract philosophical grounds now had a concrete example of the horrors that could result from the existing system. The execution provided powerful ammunition for those who argued that the law should be concerned with deterrence and rehabilitation rather than vengeance and spectacle. The practical impact on the legal system was immediate and lasting. Although dismemberment by horses was not formally abolished until the Revolution, it was never again employed as a method of execution in France. The Damiens case effectively ended the use of this particular punishment, not through legal reform, but through the sheer horror it had generated among those responsible for carrying it out. The long-term consequences of the Damiens execution extended far beyond questions of criminal justice. The event became part of the broader critique of absolute monarchy that would eventually contribute to the French Revolution. The image of royal power reduced to ordering the prolonged torture of a single pathetic individual became a powerful symbol of the moral bankruptcy of the Ancon regime. Philosophers and writers of the Enlightenment incorporated the Damiens case into their broader arguments for political and social reform. They used it to illustrate the dangers of unchecked power and the need for legal systems based on reason rather than tradition. The execution became a cautionary tale about what happened when authority was founded on fear rather than consent. The case also contributed to changing attitudes toward mental illness and criminal responsibility. Damiens' erratic behavior and contradictory statements during his trial and imprisonment led some observers to question whether he had been of sound mind when he committed his crime. This raised uncomfortable questions about the justice of executing someone who might not have been fully responsible for his actions. The story of Robert-François Damiens and his terrible end serves as a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and moral progress. The execution that was meant to demonstrate the absolute power of monarchy instead revealed the fragility of systems based on fear and violence. The horror expressed by witnesses to Damiens' death marked a turning point in European attitudes toward punishment and justice. The Damiens case illustrates the profound gap that can exist between theoretical justice and actual practice. The legal system that condemned him to death by dismemberment was operating according to centuries-old precedents and established procedures. Yet, when these abstract legal principles were translated into concrete action, the result was so horrifying that it shocked even those who had ordered it. Perhaps most troubling is the way that Damiens' execution reveals how quickly civilized society can descend into barbarism. When authority feels threatened, the man who struck the king was no dangerous revolutionary or hardened criminal. He was a confused and possibly mentally ill servant who posed no real threat to anyone. Yet the response to his act of defiance was a level of brutality that belonged more to humanity's darkest past than to the supposedly enlightened 18th century. The international attention focused on Damiens' execution also highlights the role that such spectacular punishments played in the politics of the day. Monarchies across Europe watched the French response to regicide attempt with great interest, understanding that how such challenges to royal authority were handled could influence the stability of their own thrones. The excessive brutality of Damiens' execution may have been intended to send a message to potential rebels elsewhere, but it instead sent a different message about the fundamental. Reappeared throughout history whenever established power feels challenged by those it considers beneath contempt. The capacity for cruelty revealed in the plaster grave on that March day in 1757 remains part of human nature, held in check only by the moral and legal constraints that civilized societies impose upon themselves. The legacy of Robert-François Damiens extends far beyond the immediate horror of his execution. His story became part of the intellectual foundation for the abolition of judicial torture and cruel punishment throughout Europe and eventually the world. The philosophical arguments of Enlightenment thinkers like Cesare Beccaria and Voltaire were given concrete urgency by the memory of what had happened in Paris on that terrible March day. The Damiens' execution also contributed to the broader delegitimization of absolute monarchy that would culminate in the French Revolution just 3 decades later. The image of royal power, reduced to ordering the prolonged torture of a single individual, became a powerful symbol of the moral corruption that reformers argued was inherent in systems of absolute rule. When revolutionaries later attacked the monarchy, they could point to cases like that of Damiens as evidence of the system's fundamental inhumanity. The case had important implications for the development of modern concepts of mental illness and criminal responsibility. Damiens' erratic behavior and seemingly irrational motivations raised questions about whether the legal system should distinguish between those who were fully responsible for their actions and those who might be suffering from mental illness. While these questions were not fully resolved until much later, the Damiens case was one of the early examples that forced legal theorists to grapple with such issues. The execution also marked a turning point in public attitudes towards spectacular punishment. The crowd that gathered to watch Damiens die expected to see swift, if brutal, justice. Instead, they witnessed something that called into question the entire concept of punishment as public spectacle. The horror and revulsion expressed by spectators contributed to a gradual shift away from public executions and toward more private, less spectacular forms of punishment. The international reaction to the Damiens execution helped spread Enlightenment ideas about legal reform beyond France's borders. Foreign observers who witnessed or heard about the execution carried their revulsion back to their home countries, where it contributed to pressure for similar reforms. The case became part of the broader European conversation about the nature of justice and the proper limits of state power. Perhaps most importantly, the Damiens case demonstrates the power of individual conscience to challenge established authority, even when that challenge seems hopeless and the price unbearably high. Whatever his motivations or mental state, Damiens' act of defiance against royal authority represented an assertion of human dignity in the face of overwhelming power. His terrible death, rather than serving as a deterrent to future rebels instead, became a symbol of the courage required to resist tyranny. The story of Robert-François, Damien, the last man torn apart by horses in France, thus transcends its immediate historical context to become a meditation on power, resistance, and the human capacity for both cruelty and moral progress. His execution marked the end of an era in the history of punishment and the beginning of a new understanding of justice based on humanity rather than terror. In his suffering and death, the servant who dared to strike a king achieved an immortality that no monarch could claim. The immortality of those who sacrifice everything in the name of human dignity and the possibility of a more just world. The echoes of that March day in 1757 continue to resonate today, reminding us that the struggle between arbitrary power and human dignity is never finally won, but must be fought anew by each generation. The memory of Robert-François Damiens serves as both a warning about the depths to which civilized society can sink and an inspiration for those who continue to resist injustice in all its forms.